The individual who is acting deliberately is not merely and perhaps not mainly trying to satisfy given desires. There is always really present and operative, though in the background of conclusions, the idea of and desire for a new want to be striven for when the present objective is out of the way. Wants and activity which they motivate constantly look forward to new and higher, more evolved and enlightened wants, and these function as ends and motives of action beyond the objective to which desire is momentarily directed. The object in the narrow sense of the present want is provisional. It is as much a means to a new want as end to the old one, and all intelligently conscious activity is directed forward, upward indefinitely. Life is not fundamentally a striving for ends, for satisfactions, but rather for basis for further striving. Desire is more fundamental to conduct than is achievement, or perhaps better, the true achievement is the refinement and elevation of the plane of desire, the cultivation of taste. And let us reiterate that all this is true to the person acting, not simply to the outsider, philosophizing after the event. In order to substantiate and support the doctrine thus sketched, we turn to consider briefly the opposite view, which is that of the economic interpretation. Historical, this doctrine is associated with the idea with the scientific socialism, but we are here interested in it not in connection with any propaganda or policy, but simply as a theory of conduct, as one answer to the question of the relation between economics and ethics. Our first task is to find out what the doctrine really means. The somewhat various statements of the theory reduce in general to the proposition that the course of history is determined by economic or materialistic considerations. All of these terms raise questions of interpretation, but the issue may be stated briefly. In the first place, the course of history is a matter of human behavior, and we shall, as already indicated, consider the problem in its broader aspect as a general theory of motivation. As to the word determined, it is taken for granted that conduct is determined by motives. The statement is really a truism. The issue then relates to the fundamental character of motives. Are they properly to be described as materialistic or economic in their nature? Between these two terms, it is better to use economic. A materialistic motive would seem to be a contradiction in terms. A motive is meaningless unless thought of as phenomena of consciousness. The opposite view would merely throw us back upon a denial that conduct is determined by motives at all. Without attempting a philosophical discussion of this question, we shall take the common sense position. Are human motives, then, ultimately or predominantly economic? If the expression "economic motive" is to have any definite and intelligible means, it must be possible to distinguish between economic motives and other motives. The expression is, of course, widely used in learned and scientific discussion as well as in everyday speech, with the feeling that such a differentiation exists, but examination fails to show any definite basis for it or to disclose the possibility of any demarcation which is not arbitrary and unscientific. In a rough way, the contrast between economic and other wants corresponds to that between lower and higher, or necessary and superfluous. The economic motives are supposed to be more fundamental; they arise out of necessities or at least needs, or at the very least out of the more stable, universal and materially grounded desires of men. The socialistic popularizers of the theory under consideration have leaned toward the narrower and more definite and logical conception of downright necessities. The view of the man in the street, as shown by students beginning uh, uh, the study of economics and also common in textbook definitions of the science, is that the economic side of life is summed up in making a living. But what is a living? If by a living we mean life as it is actually lived, everything is included: recreation, culture, and even religion. There is no basis for a distinction between the economic and anything else, and the term has no meaning. At the other extreme would be the idea of what is really necessary, the physiological requisites for the maintenance of life. Even this turns out on examination to be hopelessly ambiguous. Does life mean the life of the individual only, or that of the group or race? If the latter, does it include the increase of numbers, or only their maintenance at the existing level, or some other level? Does what is necessary refer to conditions under which life will be preserved, or numbers maintained or increased, or only those under which it could be done? And under what assumptions as to the tastes and standards and the scientific and technological equipment of the people? Even if we think of a population rigidly controlled as to their reproductive function, which is scarcely conceivable, the birth rate necessary to maintain numbers at a constant level would depend upon the death rate and hence would vary widely with the scale of living itself. We doubt whether the conception of necessity can even theoretically be defined in sufficient objective terms to make it available for scientific purposes. Between these two extremes of what people actually get and what they rigorously require in order to live, the only alternative is some conventional wisdom notion of what is socially necessary, or of a decent minimum. It is obvious that such a conception of a living is still more indefinite than the others, and the way seems to be closed to any objectively grounded differentiation between the making of a living and any other kind of proportion of human activity. Another common sense notion of the meaning of economic activity is that it includes everything which involves the making and spending of money, or the creation and use of things having a money value. It will presently be argued that this is substantially correct for practical purposes as far as it goes, though it directly or indirectly covers virtually the whole life activity of a modern man and has to be limited to certain aspects of that activity. It is interesting to ask how much of our ordinary activity, economic in the sense indicated, is concerned with things which can reasonably be argued to be useful, not to say necessary. If by useful we mean that it contributes to health and efficiency, or even to happiness. If we begin with food, the most material and necessary of our requirements, it is obvious that but a fraction of a modest expenditure for board in an American town would come under this head, and proceeding in order to our other material needs, clothing, shelter, furniture, etc., it is apparent that the farther we go, the smaller the fraction becomes, and it is not a necessary fraction of a fairly comfortable income which goes for all these items, if the purely ornamental, recreative, and social aspects are excluded. Moreover, when we scrutinize the actual motives of actual conduct, it is clear that the consciously felt wants of men are not directed towards nourishment, protection from the elements, etc., the physiological meaning of the things for which money is spent. They desire food, clothing, shelter, etc., of the conventional kinds and amounts. It is an ethnological commonplace that men of one social group will starve and freeze before they will adopt the ordinary diet and garb of other groups. Only under the direst necessity do we think in terms of ultimate physical needs or else ends. The compulsion to face life on this level is equivalent to abject misery. A large proportion of civilized mankind would certainly commit suicide rather than accept life on such terms, the prospect for improvement being excluded. This interpretation of motives, which is the nearest approach to a definite meaning that can be given to the economic interpretation, is almost totally false. It is simply contrary to fact that men act in order to live. The opposite is much nearer the truth, that they live in order to act. They care to preserve their lives in the biological sense, in order to achieve the kind of life they consider worthwhile. Some writer, not an economist or psychologist, has observed that the love of life, so far from being the most powerful of human motives, is perhaps the weakest. In any case, it is difficult to name any other motive or sentiment for which men do not habitually throw away their life. When we turn from the preservation of individual life to that of the race as a motive, a similar situation is met. Men will give up their lives for the group, but not for its mere life. It is for a better, or at least a worthy life that such sacrifices are made. The life of the individual is logically prior to that of the group, as our physiological needs are logically prior to the higher ones. But again, that is not the actual order of preference. Probably very few civilized men would refuse to die for their fellows if it were clear that the sacrifice were necessary and that it would be effective.